For a tired child, bedtime is always a happy and relaxing event, and they relax and drift off into a restful slumber. Some children complain when their parents force them to go to sleep before their bedtime. For me, bedtime was always fearful and terrifying event that I dreaded every night. My fear of sleeping began when I was 8 years old. My parents moved me into my own bedroom, a small and narrow room at the back of the house, just large enough for a bunk bed and a chest of drawers. It had only me, and it had a window which looked out into the back garden and didn't let much light in. It was the first time I'd ever slept on my own, and from the very first night I remember experiencing a strange feeling of unease. As I lay on the top bunk trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard a noise. I couldn't be sure, but it seemed to be coming from my bottom bunk. The room was pitch black, and the curtains on the windows let in just enough light to let me see vague shapes in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure what the noise was. Sometimes, the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. I listened closely and realized that it was the unmistakable sound of bedsheets rustling in the dark. The bottom bunk was empty, but when I peered over the edge of my bed, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. Something suddenly withdrawing out of sight into the bottom bunk, something that did not wish to be seen. I lay there in disbelief, trying to convince myself it was just my fever imagination running wild. I turned to face the wall and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep quickly. The rustling noise beneath me steadily increased until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was lurking in the bottom bunk began to toss and turn violently. Fear gripping my heart, I had terrible sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. My pulse was racing and I broke into cold sweat. I could hear the sheets thrashing back and forth below. Eventually I couldn't take the tension anymore and cried out for my mother. Suddenly the bunk bed began to shake violently, clattering against the wall. The bed sheets below me were still twisting and turning. I couldn't get out of the bed in case the thing in the bottom bunk reached out and grabbed me. I imagined it pulling me to the ankle, dragging me off into darkness. I was trapped in the top bunk like a corner rat, unable to flee. I clenched my blanket with the white knuckles and waited. The door finally burst open and my mother came in to calm me down. Tears were streaming down my face. She lay down in the empty bunk and promised me to stay there until morning. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. The next day, as I played in the backyard, I kept glancing up at my bedroom window. Each time, a chill ran down my spine and my hair stood on end. I felt like something was lurking in that room, watching me play and waiting for night to come so I could be alone with me again. I tried telling my parents about it, but they wouldn't listen to me. They just dismissed my claims as childish fears of the dark. And when I arrived, they ushered me upstairs and forced me to get into bed. "Go to bed," said my mother. "Stop being such a baby." I didn't protest. It was no use. I resigned myself to my fate, climbed up to the top bunk, got under the covers, and waited, laying there in the darkness alone, frightened. I heard the quiet rustling on the bed sheets, and I knew it. It was starting again, but this time it was different. I heard the sound of slow, rasping breathing coming from the bottom bunk. The soft wheezing made me shudder. Only a flimsy mattress separated me from whatever was lurking below. Laying there, paralyzed with fear, I just wanted to think. to leave me alone. The breathing became louder and louder, and suddenly I felt something long and thin poking at the underside of my mattress. I screamed in my horror, and the bunk bed began shaking violently. My mother came rushing and calmed me down with a comforting hug. Eventually my terror subsided, and with her standing guard, I was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. This continued for weeks. Night after night, I would wake up to the sound of rustling sheets. Each time I would scream for help, and the bed would begin to shake violently. As soon as my mother came in, everything would stop. She would have spent the rest of the night in the bottom bunk, just so I can go to sleep. It was a difficult time for my family. My grandmother was sick, and my mother had gone to take care of her. When I found out that my mother would be away for a whole weekend, I flew into panic. There would be nobody to protect me from the thing in the bottom bunk. No one would answer my cries in the middle of the night. One of the days my mother's left, I rushed home after school and immediately stripped the bed sheets and mattress off the lower bunk and removed all the slats. My plan was to prevent that thing having a place to sleep for the night. I hoped that somehow this would protect me. Fortunately, that night proved to be the most terrifying experience of all. To this day, I shudder to think about it. I managed to fall asleep, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. The room was pitch black. There was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. However, something didn't feel right. Just then, I felt the covers in my bed begin to move. The horrifying truth suddenly drew on and dawned on me. The wrenched thing that had terrorized me night after night was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth and tried to scream, but nothing came out. My eyes were wide in terror. I lay motionless, barely able to breathe. I didn't want to let it know I was awake. I could feel it laying beside me, something cold and slimy, leaning against my right arm. It was laying under the blanket. I could see it underlined, but I didn't dare to look. All of a sudden, it rolled over on top of me, and I felt its weight pressing down on me. I will never forget that awful smelling and awful feeling. Hours passed, and I lay there motionless in the darkness, too frightened to move a muscle. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Finally, I reached my breaking point and couldn't bear it a moment longer. Ever so slowly, I tried to ease myself out of there. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted my weight, moving sideways. Just as I thought it was about to escape, it moved. Dear God, it moved. I felt a clammy hand reached across the chest and close around my throat. It gripped, gradually tightened, and I felt it squeezing my neck. The slimy thing began wheezing and contouring under the blanket. I could hear it wheezing, rasping, and coughing. I felt its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. Dawn was breaking, and at the first rays of sunshine were peeking through the curtains, I felt and I fought for dear life, but I was no match for it. The fingers squeezing my neck, I felt the life leaving my life. For me, I tried to scream, but the thing grip was too tight. It was fighting to stay conscious, when suddenly it released me and slowly withdrew, melting slowly into the wall. I tumbled off the bed and screaming out of my bedroom when I got to downstairs. I breathed a sigh of relief. I had survived the most horrible experience of my life. To this day, I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bed sheets rustling in the night. I spent the entire day trying to convince my father to spend the night in my room. It took some effort, but he finally agreed. Perhaps he was just trying to humor me when my mother was away. Whatever the reason, it proved to be a smart move because in one night, it solved the problem for good. The very next morning, he stormed into my room and told me to pack up the suitcase. We were moving to a hotel.